Good morning, all saints and our streaming community. Welcome to our forum. We are going to go ahead and get started. We are running a little bit late in the 9 o'clock service, so people will be coming in, but I don't want to miss any time with Mirabai, which I'm sure you will or do agree. And it's really my great honor to introduce to you today Mirabai Starr. I first discovered Mirabai myself and her incredible work following an interspiritual workshop that I attended that left me hungering for more of that healing experience. And her work has been deeply moving and helpful to me, and that was before I was even in her presence, which we have this great experience of today. Mirabai is a scholar and a mystic who brings a completely unique background to her spiritual life and journey. She was raised in a secular Jewish household and is a translator of the Christian mystics and loved the Sufi mystical tradition and a Buddhist meditation practitioner since the age of 16. Mirabai taught philosophy and world religions at the University of New Mexico, Taos, for 20 years, and now teaches and speaks internationally on contemplative practice and interspiritual dialogue, including at Richard Rohr's Conspire, which we are familiar with. She is the author of the poetry collection Mother of God Similar to Fire, a collaboration with iconographer William Hart McNichols, and the award-winning book God of Love, A Guide to the Heart of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Her newest book, Caravan of Despair, a memoir of loss and transformation, is the winner of the Spirituality and Practice Best Books of 2015 award. And those books, they're going fast, but there are some still left over there. Mirabai has received critical acclaim for her revolutionary new translation of the mystics, and she is a certified bereavement counselor. She helps mourners harness the transformational power of loss. And it is about loss that she will speak with us today. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you for that beautiful introduction and for just welcoming me so warmly. I feel very much at home here. I think I wept through 85% of the service this morning. Were all of you there? Oh, some of you were not. Oh, wow. Is it always like this here? Amazing. And I've been staying for the past few days at the Community of Divine Love and praying the divine offices with them. So I'm in a very tender space. I had no idea that Southern California, Los Angeles, could be so rich and deep and holy. How many of you are carrying a broken heart? Go ahead, tell me. Yeah? Okay. Most of you. I am not surprised. I'm not surprised because of the topic. By the way, this is not LGBT. What did it say? LGBT something or other. It's not that topic. I'm so sorry if that's what you're expecting. I should have made that clear, but you did. Yeah. That was a mistake in the bulletin. But really, I've shifted what I planned to talk to you about because I was going to talk about Dark Night of the Soul, the teaching of the 16th century mystic, John of the Cross, and I will a little bit, but when I heard about the giving, the focus of this giving, I don't want to call it a campaign, that sounds too cold, what's happening here at All Saints, about being about our stories, I realized that might be the best thing to do with you today in the short time we have together, is tell you a little bit of my story, because it certainly connects with the teachings of the Dark Night of the Soul. And I do believe that our stories heal each other and create beloved community. But first, I want to begin with just a moment of quiet And I will lead us into that quiet by reading a prayer from this book, Mother of God, Similar to Fire. That's the actual name of an ancient Eastern Orthodox icon that have these beautiful lyrical titles. Mother of God, Similar to Fire. And I'm going to read you a prayer that is about the death of a child, or for the death of a child, but you can expand that to be about any great loss, any great loss. So as I read this prayer, I ask you to listen with your heart and then enter with me into just a moment of stillness. And you'll start with a moment of stillness while I look for the prayer. This is from the Andronicus icon of the Mother of God, consoler of women, consoler of women. Mother of mothers who weep, I come to you on my knees. The most terrible thing I could imagine has happened. I have lost my child. Oh, Blessed One, you know my pain like no other can know it. You carried the light of the world in your own body, and then knelt and swayed as he died, raged and forgave as he was tortured, surrendered and were annihilated as you held his broken body against your breast one last time. Mother of God, I have nowhere left to turn. A tidal wave of grief fills the horizon of my heart. I do not want to live in a world without my baby in it. You survived the impossible. In the wake of your child's death, you were resurrected, and now your compassion flows over the whole world. Even in this fire of anguish, Mother of Mercy, I have hope of your healing touch. Thank you for your stillness, your beautiful stillness. So, people are entering, welcome. I'm going to speak for about 20 minutes and then open it up for questions and responses. Welcome, come on in. Have you noticed how every fresh loss opens up to all the other losses you've ever experienced? It's like there's this deep well where all of our grief and loss lives, and we meet each fresh loss the best we can with courage, with an open heart, or with checking out. There are many, many options for getting away from our pain, but most of us meet our experiences with bravery and openness. And we find that whether it's the death of our dog or the ending of a long relationship or a serious health diagnosis or a terrible atrocity far away that penetrates the atmosphere like a missile and goes straight into our heart and ignites them. All of these losses are intertwined. And so there's almost no difference in a heart that's broken open anyway between a deeply personal loss and our grief for the pain of the world. Once our hearts have been shattered, there's room for the pain of the whole world. And there are entire religions that are rooted in this understanding. In fact, I'd go so far as to say, I don't know a religion on the planet that doesn't really have its roots in this understanding of the interconnectedness of all beings, and therefore the pain of the one is the pain of all of us. And so I promised I would begin by telling you my story as just one example of the universal story of the human condition of loss and transformation. And the transformation in my case was not dramatic. It wasn't some great enlightenment experience where I was lost and then I was found, I was blind and then I could see. It was, there was no road to Damascus. It was a very slow meandering through the wilderness. After a while looking around and noticing that some kind of alchemy was transmuting my broken heart. And it was subtle and it was delicate, and rather than rendering me special, it landed me squarely in the center of the human condition for the first time in my life, because I had always walked around thinking I was very special until my daughter died when she was 14 and I was 40. And this is nothing unusual. Children die all over the world, all through history, every minute of every day, all the time. But for me, it was the most profound experience of my life. So here's what happened. I had just finished translating, I don't have it with me, Dark Night of the Soul by St. John of the Cross, the 16th century Spanish mystic. The quintessential teaching on the transformational power of suffering. And what, you might ask, was a Jewish hippie girl from Taos, New Mexico, with affiliation in multiple Sufi communities, devotion to a Hindu guru, Neem Karoli Baba. Some of you might be familiar with Neem Karoli Baba, Ram Dass's guru from Be Here Now. A very dedicated Vipassana Buddhist meditation practice, translating such, not only any old Christian mystic, but one of the greatest Christian mystics of all times. I don't really know what to say, except that I loved him, and I loved Dark Night of the Soul. When I first encountered that text at age 20, I recognized it in every fiber of my being. For one thing, John of the Cross reminded me very much of Rumi, Mevlana Jalaluddin Rumi, the great Sufi mystic, who I adored, and that was one of my 3 Sufi orders that I was involved with. John of the Cross had that same passion and juiciness of burning yearning for God that Rumi had, and the same delicious metaphors of the garden and the wine and the secret rendezvous with the beloved in the middle of the night when everybody's asleep. It really spoke to my passionate heart. So years after first encountering John of the Cross, I took it upon myself to translate him upon the suggestion, really, the urging of a colleague of mine in the English department. I was in the philosophy department, and I was complaining about how my students just didn't get it, Dark Night of the Soul, whereas for me, it just resonated in every bone of my body. And so he said, my friend Sean said, why don't you translate it? And so I did, because I was fluent in Spanish. I loved the beauty of language. So I brought a writer's sensibilities to the project. And that text was the single most important spiritual text of any I had ever encountered. And by the way, I didn't mention that I was deeply engaged in every religious tradition I ever encountered. So Christianity was one of them. Christianity was kind of the last one in a long line of exploring the world's great spiritual traditions. I say spiritual traditions and not just religions because I entered each spiritual tradition I encountered through spiritual practice and allowed it to transform me. So, Dark Night of the Soul, my new, fresh translation of this mystical masterpiece, hadn't even been published yet, but the manuscript was finished and submitted to the publisher when my 14-year-old daughter Jenny had a psychotic break and took my car and drove it up into the mountains where we live outside of Taos, New Mexico, and crashed my car alone in the middle of the night under a full moon, and was not found until the middle of the next day by some road workers. That next morning, FedEx drove up the driveway to our rural home and delivered a package. And in that package was the first advance copy of Dark Night of the Soul. I hadn't been expecting it. I didn't know it was finished. And my mother, who was there with me, along with many close friends in our community, opened the package, and there was my book, Dark Night of the Soul by St. John of the Cross. And a half an hour later, actually, is when the police came to the door. Half an hour after FedEx, and they came to the door and said, I'm sorry, there's been an accident, and your daughter is gone. And so these two events coincided, right? You hear how I don't even know what word to use, and I've been talking about this for 15 years. Jenny's yahrzeit, as we say in the Jewish tradition, is October 30th, so it's coming right up. It'll be 15 years. Her birthday was last month. She would have been 30. It changes. It doesn't ever heal, but it does shift and change, right? I know many of you are nodding your heads. You know how grief works. It's not the flu. You don't get over it. It's an amputation when you experience a profound loss in it, and the limb never does grow back. And we accommodate the wound. We integrate the reality of our loss, and we find a new center of gravity. And so for me, my spiritual life, I had moved to a spiritual community when I was 14, the Lama Foundation. Have any of you heard of Lama Foundation? It's an inter-spiritual community in the mountains of northern New Mexico where Ram Dass wrote, Be Here Now. And I had moved there at 14 after another great loss, the death of my first love, Philip, who was killed in a gun accident. And so my spiritual life began with loss, and the first time, but then it really began with the loss of my daughter at 40. So I had been engaged in a lifetime of spiritual practices, rigorous spiritual practices, contemplative prayer, meditation, scripture study, silence, showing up, teaching myself to show up and be present for what is. But none of it served me when my daughter died. It all dissolved in my hands. And the only thing I knew to do was what the mystics like John of the Cross taught me, which was to do nothing, to be nothing, to set it all down and allow myself to be stripped, shattered, and ultimately blessed. in the fire of loss, to show up, to whisper my tiny, reluctant little, yes, I will be here. And my choice to be present in the fire of loss was not a spiritual practice. It wasn't on my list of methods to get me away from pain or to transcend what was happening. In fact, it was the opposite. My choice to be present in the fire of my loss was my way of honoring my daughter. It wasn't mindfulness practice as a technique to flex my spiritual muscles and get strong. I can muscle my way through this impossible anguish. It was heartfulness practice. It was an offering of love. It was saying to Jenny, I will be with you through every step of this, even though you've died. I'm going to accompany you as deeply as I can into this experience of your loss, of my loss of you. And because you are my baby, I want to go as far as I can, holding your hand to this other world that I know nothing about, maybe little hints, little glimpses. But really, I can't go with you, but I'll go as far as I can, cross that threshold. And I did, as an act of love, as an act of devotion. Do you see the difference between the rigorous discipline of spiritual practice? I can muscle my way through this experience of great sorrow, versus I'm going to open my heart and let myself down into the arms of the fire of impossible anguish. And here's a little something that happened as I made good on that promise. They surrounded me like a peasant militia trying to defend a village from an imperialist army. But no matter how valiantly my loved ones fought to protect me against the violence of my loss, they could not shield me from the inevitable. What I needed, in fact, was a moment alone so that I could begin to take it in and integrate with what had happened. A few days after Jenny's death, I convinced everyone that I would be fine on my own for a little while, and I finally had an hour to myself. I lay down on the floor and took up the work of grieving. I watched as a wall of pain rose above me, and I understood that I was powerless to get out of its path. So I surrendered and allowed it to wash over me like a tidal wave. I was willing to be obliterated. I had nothing to lose. Even as I rocked on my knees, howling, I detected soft breathing behind the roaring. I leaned in, listened. It was the murmuring of 10 million mothers, backward and forward in time. And right now, who had also lost children. They were lifting me, holding me. They had woven a net of their broken hearts, and they were keeping me safe there. I realized that one day I would take my rightful place as a link in this web, and I would hold my sister mothers when their children died. For now, my only task was to grieve and be cradled in their love. And so this was not some spiritual methodology that had been engineered over the millennia to make sacred something terrible. It wasn't a choice exactly. It was the choiceless choice to do what John of the Cross taught me, but which I forgot in that moment. Somehow I remembered in the cells of my body, not in my brain. I stopped trying to do anything and allowed myself to be with what is, which in this case was an impossible thing. And yet, as I said in the beginning, and I will close with, and then we'll do questions, I'm a 4 in the Enneagram, right? I thought I was pretty special my whole life. I had all these spiritual experiences. I was an artist and a poet, and I had many losses, starting with my brother when I was 7. But Jenny's death dissolved that delusion that I was somehow different from other people. And in that melting of that veneer of specialness, I joined the human family for the first time in my life. And I took my rightful place here, and I was welcomed. And I hated it. But here we are. And while I've always felt the pain of the world in my own heart, now I know that I am part of this net of mothers. And that as I was held in my deepest darkness, I now, as another wounded healer among a tribe of wounded healers, which is the human family, my task is to hold every mother who ever loses a child. And every day, mothers' children are dying. Got my work cut out for me. And you do too. We all belong, not in spite of our brokenness, but as a result of our great losses and our small losses. And if we can disarm our hearts when our culture conditions us to protect ourselves against the pain, if instead we can get naked on purpose and let it all in, we will find that, what John of the Cross calls that ineffable sweetness that bubbles up from the very ground of being when we offer our small and broken yes. So I have no idea what I really meant to say to you, but that's gonna be it for now, so that we have time for questions. Is there a mic for that, or should I just repeat the question? Anyone? If you can keep your questions succinct, that will be great. I'll try to keep my answer succinct too. Ha ha. Good luck, Mirabai. Sometimes a talk like this renders us kind of quiet. It's okay, I can read to you some more. Well, there's one.
Thank you for that, Mirabai.
You're welcome.
John of the Cross talks about how in time, as we say that small yes, that darkness becomes this bright light. What was your journey, and how did you reach that? And just talk a little about that.
Thank you, Ravi. So the teachings of the Dark Night of the Soul suggest that, and you may have noticed this, that there are times in our life when our spiritual feelings dry up. Have you ever had one of those dry periods in your spiritual life? And John of the Cross says that this is evidence of our spiritual maturity, that God sees that we're ready to be weaned from the divine breast. Like many mystics, John freely intermingles feminine and masculine imagery, depending on what he's trying to teach. And we are ready to have a direct encounter. so that we no longer need the soft, sweet, milky mother's nurturing. We are ready for the crusty bread of the robust. We're ready to eat the grown-up food. And weaning hurts. It's painful. It's when Abraham and Sarah created a feast for the weaning of Isaac, that was really great. You know, Isaac's getting weaned. Everybody came and ate and drank and had a good time, but not Isaac. He was sitting in the corner screaming his head off. When we're weaned from the divine breast, we usually have a little spiritual tantrum because we just want to be fed. But John of the Cross says it's time. We're mature, we're ready. And so there's this period where it feels like darkness, when some of those spiritual attachments start to fall away. I mean, we don't feel ready. In fact, we often think we're doing something wrong. But he says, if we stay with it and endure that aridity and show up anyway through contemplative prayer, through just being present and not pushing it away, that darkness, we will progress to the state of the adept, which is then really good news. All of our conceptual constructs unravel, come tumbling down, and we no longer believe anything really. All our belief systems reveal themselves to be empty, and they crumble. And nothing's holding us up anymore. So we don't have the juicy spiritual sensations anymore, which the mystics call consolations, and nor do we have a viable belief system to uphold us. This is the dark night of the soul. This, John of the Cross says, is good news. And although it feels like terrible darkness, it's actually unutterable radiance. And what's happening is that we are stripped so that we can have a direct experience of the divine. And the direct experience of the divine is absolute radiance, but we're not used to it yet. And so it's blinding, like Plato's prisoners fettered to the cave, who the one guy gets away, or woman, let's say it's a woman, gets away up to the real world where there's real light, and it's blinding. It's blinding at first. So you asked what was my experience. It was subtle, it was slow, and I will say, this is just spontaneously coming to me as I conclude this very long-winded answer to your very short question, that the way that light came back to me is through a kind of childlike wonderment, that little by little, the world revealed itself to me as heartbreakingly beautiful. And the smallest, most ordinary things became exquisite, broke my heart open. The simplicity of the beauty of this world, the beauty and the brokenness of this world, that's where the light began to re-enter. Thank you for your question.
I'm Natalie. You know, you may already have answered partially the question I had. After 30 years of a marriage, an unexpected separation and divorce left me completely, smacked. And I was leaning into all that I could, having, like you, done all this spiritual work before, leaning into the grief and the fear and the loss and everything. And people said to me, much to my amazement, that I looked beautiful, even though I felt terrible.
Wow.
I wonder if you could comment on that.
Yeah. You do look beautiful, Natalie. Yeah, I don't recall people saying that to me, but I do feel that, so the mystics speak about being stripped of everything that stands between ourselves and a naked encounter with the beloved. And that nakedness is a beautiful, beautiful thing. And spiritual practice can do it, but man, there's nothing like a great loss to just peel off those layers and reveal who we really are. And who we really are isn't always just love and light. I mean, I was a bitch when Jenny died. I was grumpy, and I was irritable, and I felt like it also brought out the worst in me. And that's what's holy, you guys, is all of it. Everything reveals itself to be sacred. I mean, we know this intellectually, that everything's holy. But when we have nothing to defend ourselves with anymore, then we experience that our beauty and our brokenness are intermingled, just as the beauty and brokenness of the world fits in the vast container of our hearts, of our shattered hearts. There's room for all of it. And I guess maybe that's the other gift, the other ray of light that entered my life, is that there was no longer this dualistic distinction between even good and evil. I mean, clearly when we look around, there is evil in this world, and it is our task to rise up. We're all prophets and we're all called, as Mike so beautifully summoned us this morning. It's our turn, because there is darkness and there is evil. And Tikkun Olam, the teaching of Judaism, that the world is a shattered vessel, and that each one of our tasks is to lift up the shards of light and restore wholeness to the world. It's all true, and it's also true that everything is of God, and therefore everything is holy. And so how do we walk with that mystical paradox of knowing that our true prophetic task is to engage in tikkun olam, to help lift up the shards of light and restore the world to wholeness in any and every way that we can, and also to bow at the feet of the mystery of the intermingling of pain and beauty that is this world.
Thank you for sharing your grief with us and showing up.
Thank you.
And everything that you've said so far has been a sort of deeply personal story. And I wanted to shift more in line with Mike's sermon, a sort of communal story and communal grieving. You mentioned this already in the network of mothers who suffer the loss of their children and notions of interbeing. But I was wondering whether you have some suggestions for us for communal grieving and communal healing.
Yes, thank you for that. And that was going to be my talk. And the reason I shifted it was that I listened to the theme of our stories for your project of giving this fall, and I realized it would be disingenuous for me to just speak in generalities. And so I chose to do a very naked thing and tell my story. Well, I did it in this book, but I usually don't talk about it so much. So I believe I also was referring to it just now when I suggested that we're all prophets and that we are all hearing the bellowing summons of the prophetic call right now to stand up in the face of injustice and move beyond our personal comfort zones and do whatever we possibly can to speak truth and to stand with those on the margins. And we do so not, my suggestion is that we do so not from a rigid sense of righteousness, that is right and wrong, and there are the perpetrators and the victims, and we're going to stand with the victims, and the perpetrators are evil, but rather with our hearts disarmed and our ears open to listening to the pain of those who perpetrate violence and hatred, and to have us as our beginning stance a listening heart, a heart that knows that we know nothing, that we may have clear ideas and philosophies and political belief systems in place that serve us well, but that if we begin from a place of not knowing rather than a place of having it all figured out, if we allow the pain of the world, like the mother, to first enter every cell of our body, if we begin by gathering the suffering of the world into our arms, whether we're men or women, and holding it and listening, rather than imposing our fixed ideas about what to do, then I believe that the pain of the world fits inside our vast, open, vulnerable, humble hearts. And that becomes the starting place from which we offer whatever we can do to soothe the wounds of the world, knowing that we know nothing, but that we have to rise up anyway. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Starr. I'm Philip, and I've been touched by your story, as I think we've heard from Natalie and Joseph, how your story has touched them and with resonance. And my question, in a way you've just touched on, I think, that is, some of us, many of us, know and live with friends who are in hospice now, or friends who are going through cognitive impairment and loss. And so there is grieving in our friendships and in our families and in our caregiving in our lives. Yet I feel at times I still have energy for connecting to them in some way. And how shall I do that most helpfully in your experience? Because I sometimes think when I open my heart, I don't open it enough, or I'm opening it the wrong way, and maybe I'm telling my story instead of listening to their story.
Yes,
you see what I mean?
That's it. And I'm aware that we're out of time. Are we? And so I will answer that as succinctly as I can. Thank you for your question. My best friend is dying right now. I mean, like right now. In fact, it's been hard to be away this weekend because it's the end, and toward the end, and I've been with her every step of her cancer. So that's really touching me personally right now. And I think that for those of us who sit with the dying, the trick is to not say a whole lot. And those of us who sit with the grieving, it's our listening heart that is our greatest gift. And as people let go of this life, they're becoming less and less interested in the content of the words, and more resting in the sweetness of the stillness and the love that we can hold with them. Thank you.